When it comes to standing up against racism and discrimination, do you have any advice for young people? What can they do? What actions can they take tomorrow to really start making a difference?
Yeah, so for me, I think, so I would say young people should be careful that in the process of, fighting racism, they also don't become racist themselves. Because it's a fine line, that you will walk in some instances where your actions or your reactions will then, be tagged as being racist. So I think, so we need to be careful and first come to reality about our own individual inherent biases. We have those biases, and they come from our family systems. They come from, our growing up, the kind of, what we're fed with in terms of information about humanity, the kind of exposure we have to, to information, the books we read, the programs we watch on TV, those things that reinforced our individual biases. We need to identify those biases, and then we can use gray lens to then analyze our observations. So we see racism everywhere. We encounter racism everywhere. And again, like I said, it goes beyond loud mouthing and, making a lot of noise about it. It's also about our individual reaction to racism. So how do we react? And people take a lot of cues from our actions, what we do, what we say. So we need to be careful about our reaction to racism. So for me, my practical 2 cents will be: one, reflecting and coming to reality or coming to terms with the reality of our biases. Two, trying to analyze our observations through gray lens so that we can be fair and kind of objective with our conclusions.
Thank you, Jonah. Yeah, I always say if you have a brain, you have bias. And I think it, as you say, it really starts with acknowledging that, because the only way to break the bias is to confront yourself and challenge your bias first. So thank you for sharing that. Ariza, are there any things that you can add to that, or maybe specifically also for the Asian community, things that they can do, organizations that they can join, or steps that they can take?
Sure, thank you. So I really want to tell young people, especially in the audience, to start small. I think that sometimes we look at these problems and they seem so big and so overwhelming, but really there's so much change we could do just looking at the immediate communities around us. Like, aside from looking at the biases and the judgment that we do, the prejudices that we have, family is usually a place where there could be some racism that's being said, that's being experienced among our friends, our schoolmates, our workmates. And one of the funny instances that I usually experience some form of racism is whenever people I meet, or acquaintances, or even friends I have, ask me, where did you learn to speak English? Because we can, really understand you well and perfectly. So you must have learned probably in the US or in Europe, but no, I actually studied in the Philippines. So small things like that, just sharing concerns about little things that happen in our daily lives is already so important. Talking to our family members, our friends, our schoolmates, the small people around us. And I think by starting small, you're also addressing the immediate concerns of your community. I think racism is happening everywhere, but it manifests in different forms from one community to the other. So it could be racism against Asian Americans on one end, or you could have the vilification of different ethnicities or tribes in another end. So we really have to think, in my community, what's the best thing I can do with the people around me, whether it's organizing a fundraiser to help people who are being most affected by racism, or whether it's getting people of different races or ethnicities to come together on one dinner table and talk amongst themselves, or share, or create something together. Then all of these smaller approaches really in the end build up to something big. So I would advise the young people to start small.
Thank you. That is really good advice. So Mike, also from the UK perspective, anything to add regarding actions or maybe organizations that people, I would say young, old, and in between, can join to really show their solidarity and really become an ally to Black and minority ethnic people?
I mean, it's brilliant. All the stuff that's been said by the two panelists are amazing. It's quite difficult to add to that, actually. I was thinking as they were speaking, how true everything is. Racism is so large. It's such a structural and a global thing that it oftentimes makes younger people and everyone really feel small. And sometimes, if you're pessimist leaning, you kind of go, what's my tiny action going to contribute? And there's two things I hold dear that I think should govern people as they decide what to do. One is this phrase, and that is that we change the world by changing a world. And if we think about things that way, the one friend you have or the one auntie in your family, really hyper focusing on the kind of influence you can have on them, in turn leads to a world that changes. You can't think in global terms all the time. You've got to really think locally. The second thing is, as a Christian, I love the Bible, and there's one particular scripture that I think always helps me. It's in 2 Corinthians 2:14. It speaks about diffusing the fragrance of God's wisdom, and I love the way that's put, because what it often connotes is that there's a fragrance that comes from people trying to make the world better. And that fragrance, it draws people in, it makes them better. It's a very unifying force. And so equally, as you try to go around, different pockets and different tribes you're in, if you're committed to the things we're talking about, there's a fragrance that emits from you. And part of that, should drive you then, as you've said, to join organizations. All it takes is a Google search to find wonderful organizations you can donate to. But I really think it's in those day-to-day experiences and interactions, the office place, the trading floor, the changing rooms. It's in those places, if you're alert, that you can catch things and go, hold on a minute, that's a bit odd. What did you mean by that? Or you can educate people. I also want to make it very clear that everyone watching this probably is really into anti-racism. And so, it feels sometimes like I'm preaching to the choir here in a wonderful church service. We've got to think about folks who wouldn't ordinarily think about themselves as racist or wouldn't attend these lovely events. Think about how we can bring them into the conversation too. Because if we're serious about systems change, you can't just preach to the converted. You've also got to engage with people who maybe don't see themselves getting involved in this work at all.
Amen to that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing that. You're absolutely right. All right, so we're nearing the end of this panel session, although I could listen to the three of you for another 3 hours, but I did want to take a moment to address the racial discrimination that has become a topic of discussion because of the things that we've seen happening in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Wars and conflict situations are massive triggers for racial discrimination and victimization. And I want to give each of you a moment to share your thoughts on this, but I would also like to end with hope. So there's a lot happening in the world right now, and a lot of it is bad. But I was wondering, what are your thoughts on how the young people of the world are dealing with these conflicts, not just Russia and Ukraine, because there are other places where there is war too. And what is one thing that you have seen happening that gives you hope for a better future? Jonah, let's start with you on this one.
Okay, so I will start by just telling you a short story about the outcome of the war between Ukraine and Russia. So I have an HR friend who told me about our experience of checking out for people in Europe, and of course she was sharing something that touched me. So she told me about how all of a sudden in the same office, Ukrainians started reacting in a funny way to Russians in the same office. So this is they are in a neutral ground. They are in France, and then so Ukrainians are turning against their yesterday friends. People that they dined together a night before, people that they went partying together a night before. All of a sudden, they became enemies and started profiling themselves. And of course, in the same scenario, then she told me about another office in Switzerland, where same Ukrainians were shading Russians who were being subjected to undue racial assault, and of course that touched me as well. So I got two extremes. So the first one was negative, and then the second one was positive. So that gives me hope that, of course, within the context of what is currently happening, there are still some people who are seeing or they are subjecting what they are seeing to different angles, and they're trying to see it from different point of view, and they are choosing to be neutral. They are choosing to say, look, it should not be about us. It should not be about you and I. We dined together yesterday. We partied together yesterday. Nothing should come between us. We should be the same. We should be friends that we've always been. So, for me, what I've taken out of that is, the first thing is, we need to show empathy. We need to really see it. Of course, if he needs us to have conversation, let's have conversation. So for me, the key word is empathy. Because we are all going through that stress. I have Ukrainian friends who are going through that stress. They have family members back in Ukraine. They are scared. They don't know what will happen tomorrow. I have Russian friends. It's the same thing. So, I've seen that, look, empathy is a key thing here, where you can just show that simple act of kindness, to just check out and say what is happening. So for me, keyword is empathy. When, of course, people are going through what they did not plan for, and all of a sudden they have to deal with what they are dealing with.
Yeah, absolutely. The power of empathy. Thank you. All right, so we have a couple of minutes left. Mike, what gives you hope when you look at the world right now?
Well, we are seeing young people mobilizing. The situation in Ukraine, and in Somalia and Yemen, because of social media, it's easier to learn about these issues, and more people are being mobilized. That does give me hope. It's important for people to realize that anything we hold dear is fragile. Democracy is fragile. Do not for a second think, because you live in the West, that somehow everything's sorted and you can just relax. Not true. You've got to be alert. You've got to be awake. And if that means starting an organization, donating, applying pressure to the system, voting, advocating, do it all. Because if we want democracy, we have to always fight for it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Ariza, over to you. Your words of hope.
Thank you. Going back to the topic of war, I think that both racial discrimination and war operate on the principle of violence. And this violence doesn't necessarily have to be physical, but it's definitely there, the violence and hatred. So I think that our role, especially young people, is to reiterate the opposite of violence, nonviolence, the opposite of hatred, love. And people don't realize it, but when you wage a war, you use a lot of resources, you use so much strategy, you plan for so long, you have generals, you have leaders, and we have to do the same when we're waging peace. So we have to wage peace as strongly as others wage war. We need a plan, we need our strategy, we need our leaders, we need our foot soldiers, we need maybe use stories and books as our bullets. We need platforms or battlegrounds such as social media that we can use. So this really has to be something aggressive that we do, this waging peace. And what gives me hope right now is that young people are starting to do this by working together. And for me, that's just magic. Seeing young people all over the world, for instance, joining hands, working together, sharing resources to help their fellow citizens in Ukraine, that's amazing. Seeing people help each other throughout COVID-19, seeing young people from different colors, ethnicities, religions, working together to help us through climate change, the mental health crisis, and so many other issues like racial discrimination. It's starting, and I think we just need to keep going.
Wow. Thank you, Ariza. Thank you, all three of you. Empathy, action, and collaboration. I think that's what it's all about. All right. Well, that's all we have time for today. I want to sincerely thank all three of you, Ariza, Jonah, and Mike, for joining us today. I'm grateful for the insights and the inspiration that you have shared. I really think you have given the audience something to chew on and some concrete things that they can start doing tomorrow. And I think you've definitely given all of us hope that today's young people really will be able to change the narrative, to drive action and to be the change that they want to see. So thank you to everyone watching for being here, for tuning in. And I sincerely hope you enjoy the rest of this anti-racism live digital event.